to Recovery Queen Melissa Presents Tales from the Trap. I'm your host, Melissa McMillan. I'm a recovering addict, a human trafficking survivor, and yes, a human trafficking convict. I spent 20 years living in active addiction, experiencing things most couldn't imagine. This podcast is where we tell the truth about the streets, about the system, about survival, recovery, trauma, and the people who never made it out. These stories are raw, real, and sometimes they're hard to hear, but you know what? They matter. This is Tales from the Trap. So before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I am coming to you from the traditional territory of the Atikameksheng and Anishinaabeg within the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. I honor the Anishinaabe people of Atikameksheng who cared for this land, its waters, and all living things since the dawn of time. I recognize the sovereignty of the Anishinaabe nations, and I acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonization that continue to affect their communities. This acknowledgement is not just about the past, it is a call to uphold our responsibility under treaty, to live in right relationship, and to support truth, reconciliation, and justice with the people of Atikameksheng and Anishinaabeg. Hello, welcome back to Tales from the Trap. I am your host, Melissa McMillan, and tonight we have a very special episode for you. So I've written everything down because usually I do my episodes pretty well off the fly, but there are some subject matter that is just too important to do off the top of my head. So I have written what I can down, and I will be reading from a script probably the entire time. So this podcast is usually about addiction, about recovery and survival, trauma, and what it means to make it out alive. But some things are bigger than our personal pain. Some things are too urgent to stay quiet about. Because what's happening right now in Gaza isn't a relapse. It isn't even a struggle. It's an extermination. This isn't a conflict. It's an occupation turned into a genocide. And the world is watching. The world is watching it unfold in real time. In this episode called The Indictment, I'm not talking about recovery, but I am talking about accountability. I'm laying out the case against the Israeli government and the international powers that protect it. From the bombing of hospitals and refugee camps to the starving of entire families. From killing journalists who are just reporting on the truth to newborns being left to die in their NICU beds. This episode names what the headlines won't. It's a genocide, live streamed. So before we start, I need to say this very clearly, not as a formality, but as truth. When I speak about what's happening in Gaza, I'm not speaking about Jewish people. This is not about a religion or a faith or a culture that has survived thousands of years of exile and persecution and genocide. This is about a government and a political ideology, and those are not the same thing. Judaism is a faith. It's a people who have carried tradition and prayer and identity through the darkest chapters of human history. People who were nearly erased by fascism, yet still kept their humanity intact. Judaism is a spiritual, ancestral culture, and it is about community, survival, and a connection to God. To be Jewish is not to be responsible for a government's crimes, just like Christians aren't responsible for colonialism or Muslims. They're not responsible for terrorism. Zionism, on the other hand, is a political ideology born in the late 1800s that called for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine. It began as a reaction to centuries of anti-Semitic violence in Europe, which at the time was understandable. People wanted safety and sovereignty. They wanted a home. But over time, the project of Zionism became militarized, nationalized, and expansionist, leading to the displacement and oppression of the Palestinian people. That shift from seeking safety to enforcing supremacy is where the difference lies. Not all Jewish people are Zionists. In fact, many Jewish people from around the world, rabbis and scholars, activists and Holocaust survivors, and young people, are standing in solidarity with the Palestinians right now. They march in the streets and they chain themselves to government buildings. They say, "Not in our home." They're risking their reputations, their careers, even their safety to speak truth to power, because they know that Jerusalem's heart is justice, not occupation. So when I speak about Israel, I'm speaking about a state, a military, a government led by Benjamin Netanyahu, not a religion and not a people. I'm speaking about actions, policies, and war crimes, not beliefs, not identities. The world needs to separate those truths because anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are not the same thing. Criticizing a government for committing a genocide is not hate speech. It's a moral responsibility. And confusing the two only protects the powerful while silencing the victims.
يعني عماله الاقتحامات اللي بتحصل هي نوع من البطش والارهاب. يعني احنا بنشوف كيف عماله بيتعامل بعنف مع المارة، مع اصحاب المحلات، مع البيوت. يعني في سياره شخصيه، انا سيارتي الشخصيه الدوريه عماله يعني شفت كيف صدمت فيها يعني عرضتها لاتلاف. ما في مراعاه لطفل صغير بده يمر، لستة تروح على بيتها. عماله العنف المتزايد من الجنود ومن المستوطنين بدون حدود. يعني الارهاب اللي عماله بنشوفه في تزايد وفي تسارع بدون يعني محرمات، بدون خط احمر.
Don't twist my words. This isn't about faith. It's not about Torah or synagogue or tribe. It's about a government. Benjamin Netanyahu's government, and a military that answers to him, dropping bombs on children and calling it defense. They have no army, no jets of their own, no tanks rolling through the streets to protect them. Only mothers carrying their babies through rubble that used to be their homes and smoke that used to be their lives. It's about hospitals, sacred, untouchable, turned into tombs. Ar-Shifa, Al-Qid, and Ar-Nasar. Doctors wrap infants in blankets too thin to survive, while generators die, and tiny hearts fade into silence because the hands that should be there to save them can't even reach them. And schools, classrooms where children learned letters, now buried under concrete. Refugee camps, tents pitched in hope, turned to ash. Lines for bread and for water and medicine turned into graves. And when the ships came from the sea, carrying milk and medicine and hope, they were stopped, intercepted, seized, illegally boarded in international water. Even mercy is criminalized. Half of Gaza are children. half. Little girls with dolls and little boys with notebooks. But instead of writing on them, they're writing their names on their arms because they've already learned what it means to live in a place where breathing can be an act of protest. Their lullabies are drones. Their playgrounds are rubble and their prayers are whispered in fear. And the journalists, the ones who stayed when everyone else fled, they fell with their cameras wide open. Their lost images, proof that truth itself was under fire. 200 dead reporters. Over 200 voices silenced mid-sentence, telling the world what the world didn't even want to see. So don't call it war, okay? There's no armies there. Only civilians, only mothers, only fathers, only children, only people living under the power of a state that decides whose life matters and whose do not. And the world, we just scroll past. Some of our governments nod, some look away, some say it's too complicated, as if the people trapped in Gaza could fight back with anything but hope. This isn't about Jews, not at all. It's about a government, a military, policy made into punishment, orders written to erase existence, and mothers still whisper, Allah Akbar, not in defiance, not in hate, but in survival. Faith that they might still live in the shadows of destruction. And then you remember the irony, the bitter, burning irony. This entire state built to prevent these exact horrors.
This desperate call for help was from Hind, a 6-year-old Palestinian girl who has been missing in Gaza since the 29th of January. She was trapped inside a car, surrounded by the bodies of her family members, all of them killed by Israeli fire. According to the Palestine Red Crescent Society, when they were attacked by Israeli forces. Just moments before, there was a call from Hind's cousin, 15-year-old Layan Hamadeh, who was shot at while on the phone.
انت جوا السيارة؟ الو
Pursuing military.
Was 6 years old when Israelis killed her. His mother was 6 years old. Lincoln, you will be remembered as the butcher of Gaza.
I beg you, I'll go onto my knees and I will beg you. I'm a proud man and I'm a nurse. I paid to go to Palestine myself. I've had babies die in my arms. They shot pregnant women in front of me.
This isn't a war. Okay, it's an occupation. It's a blockade. It's collective punishment. It's children hiding in the dark because night is safer than day. It's babies dying in incubators because the power went out. It's journalists killed for simply seeing, simply recording, simply telling the world. They said never again. They said never again. And to statelessness, to siege, to children buried alive. They said never again. But Netanyahu's government has turned those words to ash, and the world just watches. This isn't religion. It's not Judaism or Christianity or Islam. It's corruption of power, the betrayal of humanity, the lesson of history twisted into justification. And still, the people whisper, Allah Akbar. Because whispering is survival. Because breathing is defiance. Because living is rebellion when the state wants to erase you. They have no army. They have no shields. They have only life, only resistance in the form of being alive. And the truth is bigger than any bomb, louder than any blockade, stronger than any silence the world imposes. Before the borders were drawn by outsiders, before the walls and the checkpoints and the bloodshed, there was a land called Palestine. Sometimes they called it Judea. But in that land, Jews, Christians, and Muslims all lived together. Not perfectly, but in peace. Families traded with one another. Children went to school together, and markets bustled with the prayers of mosques, the bells of churches, and the songs of synagogues. Neighbors knew neighbors. They celebrated holidays together, and they mourned together. They shared the land, the olive trees, the water, and the sun. In Jerusalem, in Haifa, in Nazareth, in villages across the hills and valleys, people, they coexisted. They married across lines at times, shared food and shared stories. Life was complex, sure, but the land was home to all of them. And then the outside world intervened. Colonial powers redrew maps. Nationalist movements grew. European Jews fleeing persecution began immigrating in waves. Conflicts escalated, of course, often manipulated by those in power and guns, not ordinary people just trying to live their lives. Tensions rose, and by 1941, just before the horrors of World War II spilled into every corner of the globe, the land that had known coexistence was already cracking. This is a story they rarely tell you, of course, that Jews and Christians and Muslims had shared a home for centuries, that coexistence was possible and it was real. And yet, that peace was ripped apart by war, by occupation, by politics. Before the Nakba, before the blockades, before the starvation, there was a place where neighbors were neighbors, where faith didn't mean fighting and identity didn't mean exile. And remembering that is crucial because it shows what was lost and what humanity can rebuild if we ever dare to return to it. When World War II ended, Europe was in rubble and the Jewish people were shattered. 6 million murdered in the Holocaust. Entire families erased. Survivors staggered out of camps with no homes to return to. Many of their towns in Poland, Germany, and Hungary were gone or hostile. So, tens of thousands became what the world called displaced persons. They were stateless, people without a country. At the time, Palestine was still under British mandate. A Jewish migration there had already risen since the 1930s. The Nazi genocide turned that trickle into a flood. Ships like the Exodus, 1947, carried survivors who believed Palestine could be a refuge. But Britain, exhausted from war and facing Arab resistance, limited immigration. Refugees crowded into camps in Cyprus and the ports of Haifa. Palestinians at the time lived under colonial administration too. Many did help early arrivals, giving shelter, selling land, believing there was room for neighbors fleeing horror, but no one imagined that compassion would be turned into displacement. So this next part, I'm going to go very slow so everybody understands. So in 1947, the United Nations proposed to divide Palestine into 2 states. So 55% of the land for a Jewish state, 45% of the land would be an Arab state, and Jerusalem would be internationalized. The Jewish population was roughly 1/3 of the people, but would receive over half of the territory. Of course, Palestinian leaders and surrounding Arab governments rejected the plan as another colonial carve-up, but Jewish leaders, desperate for a state after centuries of persecution, accepted it. So the British prepared to withdraw, and civil war erupted between communities. On May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel. The next day, neighboring Arab armies entered. What followed wasn't just a war, it was a transformation of the land itself. And by the time the deals were signed in 1949, Israel controlled about 78% of Palestine, far more than the UN had granted. So for Palestinians, that year became the Nakba, Arabic for the catastrophe. Between 700,000 and 800,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled amid the fighting. More than 400 villages were destroyed or emptied, their names erased from the maps. Families left with keys in their pockets, believing they'd return in weeks. Those keys still hang on walls in refugee camps today. So a quick interjection, a little personal interjection. I've actually seen these keys. So I'm involved in a group called Palestinian Solidarity Sabri. And they organize rallies and marches and just offer education on the conflict. And one of the first rallies we had, there was hundreds of people there, and we had a bunch of guest speakers. And one of the members of the Solidarity group has an uncle who has one of these keys that was passed down since that time. And he showed it to us. And it's true, they really did think that they were going to go back. So I'm sorry if I butcher this name, but massacres like Deir Yassin spread terror, convincing civilians to run. Those who tried to return were labeled infiltrators and often shot. Their lands were seized under Israel's new absentee property laws and given to incoming Jewish immigrants, many of them Holocaust survivors. That's the cruel twist of history here. Survivors of one genocide became citizens of a new state built on another person's disposition. Trauma met trauma, and the world, we just looked away. I would like you to think about that for a moment. These were people who had just walked out of death camps, tattooed numbers on their arms, the smell of ashes still in their lungs, and Europe had turned their backs on them, locked its doors. So when Zionist leaders promised a homeland, safety, dignity, belonging, it sounded like salvation. But salvation for one people became catastrophe for another, because the land that they were promised was not empty. It was Palestine. Olive groves, villages, markets, children flying kites, people with names and families and stories that stretched back centuries. The world owed the Jewish survivors justice, but it paid the debt with Palestinian land. Instead of holding Europe accountable for its crimes, colonial powers exported the problem to the Middle East. They gave away a country that wasn't theirs to give. The same empires that drew borders with rulers in red ink, Britain, France, signed off on this new arrangement. And that's the poison at the root of the conflict. Europe tried to heal its guilt by wounding someone else's. So that's what I mean when I say trauma met trauma. The Holocaust should have taught humanity never again to dehumanize a people. Instead, it became the justification for another people's dehumanization. That's not blaming the victims of the Holocaust. It's blaming the governments, the colonial mindset, the political project that decided survival had to come at someone else's expense. Because if survival depends on another person's displacement, it's not liberation, it's a transfer of pain. The descendants of genocide survivors inherited safety, yeah, sure, okay, but built on the ruins of another person's homes? And the descendants of the displaced inherited exile, statelessness, and the label of terrorist for daring to want their homes back. Every key hanging in a refugee camp, every grandmother still holding the deed to her land is a mirror held up to the conscience of the world. It asks, whose suffering really counts? Whose history gets to be believed? And how long will the powerful trade one people's freedom for another? That's the cruel twist, the one we're still living in. The children of survivors building walls to keep another people contained. The people who once fled ghettos, now guarding checkpoints that cage families. History repeating, not because it has to, but because the world still hasn't learned the lesson it promised it would never forget. So now I'm going to talk about what these conditions in Gaza are creating. So when you trap more than 2 million people inside a strip of land only 40 kilometers long and it's hemmed in by concrete and wire, you create pressure that no society can survive unchanged. Gaza has been sealed off since 2007. Okay, so that means every truckload of food, every liter of fuel, every vial of medicine passes through a checkpoint controlled by forces outside its borders. Fishermen are stopped by boats at gunpoint if they sail out too far. Students lose scholarships because they can't even reach their universities abroad. And the average person has endured repeated bombings, lost homes because cement is restricted, and they live without power because it only flickers on a few times a day. 90% of water is unsafe to drink, and unemployment hovers around 50%. Half the population are children who have never seen a life without blockades. And those children, they don't just inherit poverty, they inherit memory too. They grow up listening to their grandparents tell them stories of the Nakba, when over 700,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes, entire villages wiped off the map, their names erased and replaced. They hear about all the olive trees burned, families forced to march for miles with nothing but the key to the houses that they'll never even see again. These stories aren't ancient history either, they're living wounds, passed down around kitchen tables lit by candlelight because, like I said, there's no electricity. Every generation in Gaza grows up carrying the grief of the last, a memory of disposition that never ended, just changed form. And when people grow up like that, it eats at their soul. Every border denial, every night without light, every air raid siren tells them that the world doesn't believe that they're worth saving. And when hope collapses, something else rushes in to fill the space. Anger, ideology, the promise that only violence will be heard. That's how fundamentalism takes root. It doesn't start as religion. It starts as despair. And groups like Hamas, they draw power from that despair. They tell an entire generation born behind walls that the only language the world recognizes is force, okay? They mix faith with fury and they call it resistance. Most Gazans don't choose that path. Most oppose it. But when there's no political horizons, no economy, no free movement, extremists offer the only narrative that explains the pain. We suffer because we are occupied and only we can fight. That's how a siege turns into a breeding ground. Not because people are inherently violent, but because decades of humiliation, of poverty, and inherited trauma makes peace feel like a fucking lie. If the world truly wants to end extremism, it has to end the conditions that breed it. Freedom of movement, access to work, education, and dignity are the best antidotes for fanaticism. You can't bomb an idea out of existence. You can only starve it of the suffering that feeds it.
Sorry to say that your mass media, the Western mass media, always beside the Israelis. Your baby in this area. And you are forgetting completely this organized terrorism, even in the United Nations Security Council. You refuse to condemn this barbarian attack on the South, but you bless it. And you said that we accept the raid, but it was a little bit more than required. I have to ask those who used to speak about human rights. Where is this human rights there in this house? Did you see the picture there? Our camps, Lebanese villages who had been smashed completely, some of these villages had been smashed with Phantom, with Skyhawk, with Mirage, with F-15, with Cancer bomb, with Lance rocket. Civilian war, yes? Because it is your baby who did it.
So you can't talk about Palestinian resistance after 1967 without talking about Yasser Arafat's first. He was born in 1929 and he became the symbol of Palestinian nationalism, the face of a people who had lost their homes, who had been scattered, who had been living under occupation for decades. He was the co-founder of Fatah in the late 1950s, a movement dedicating to liberating Palestine through armed struggle, not for the sake of violence itself, but because Palestinians had no state, no recourse, and no rights. For decades, he was the figure who represented Palestinian dignity on the world stage, walking a tightrope between diplomacy and resistance. Then came Oslo, 1993. There was hope and headlines and handshakes and a promise of statehood. Arafat returned to Gaza and the West Bank. As the first president of the Palestinian Authority, Palestinians dared to dream again. But that promise soon collapsed under settlements and occupation and bureaucracy. And alongside the occupation's pressure, Arafat's own leadership had many cracks. Corruption seeped into the Palestinian Authority. Public funds mismanaged and friends and family were enriched. Ordinary Palestinians, they continued to suffer. And Arafat sometimes seemed more concerned with staying in power than delivering justice or reform. That failure eroded faith in political solutions, and it opened space for groups like Hamas to grow. They portrayed themselves as the uncorruptible and the voice for the forgotten. So after 9/11, the Western media reported that Palestinians were cheering, and that's true, but it needs context. It wasn't celebrating attacks on civilians. It was about anger towards decades of United States policy in the Middle East. The US had long backed Israel, providing military aid, providing political support, and veto power in the United Nations. So, for Palestinians trapped under occupation, seeing the US weapons, funding, and political protection of Israel, while their homes were demolished, their families restricted, their children starving or injured, it felt like the world was actively against them. So, when a catastrophic event like 9/11 happened, some people expressed shock and rage as a distorted outlet for years of frustration. It wasn't moral approval of mass murder, it was despair expressing itself in the only loud way they felt like they could be heard. This is a dangerous dynamic when people are trapped and humiliated and ignored. Even those who would normally reject violence can express support for anyone striking against the system that they blamed for their suffering. It's not about ideology. It's about the psychological impact of occupation, of blockades, and chronic oppression. So groups like Hamas and other extremist networks have always understood this rage and frustration. They frame it as resistance, tapping into feelings of anger towards Israel and the US and presenting themselves as the only ones that will fight back. And that's how despair turns into extremism. When generations grow up feeling abandoned by the world, oppressed by the powerful, and ignored by the very institutions that claim to uphold justice. So by 2007, Gaza was completely sealed off. Hamas had consolidated power after winning elections in 2006, and Fatah was isolated in the West Bank. And what happened next wasn't politics, it was punishment. Israel and Egypt closed every border, cutting off food and medicine, fuel, and building materials. Electricity, it only ran a few hours a day, if that. Hospitals struggled to perform surgeries. Water was completely unsafe. Jobs vanished. Half the population was unemployed, and children had never known a normal life. Hamas understands the anger that comes from this. They didn't create it, the occupation and the blockade did, but they wrapped it in ideology, claiming to defend Palestinians where the world and the PA, the Palestinian Authority, had failed. They ran hospitals and schools when the PA didn't. They delivered aid when trucks couldn't cross borders. They presented themselves as incorruptible in a system where corruption had left people helpless. For many Palestinians, especially the young and desperate, Hamas became a voice. Not because everyone agreed with their politics, of course, but because the alternative every single time had failed them. And when there's no hope, when survival is a daily struggle, radical ideas look like the only way to be heard. Extremism grows not in a vacuum, but in cages, in darkness, under checkpoints, behind walls, where the future seems permanently blocked. Children grow up thinking oppression is normal. In Gaza, every bomb, every raid, every power cut, every destroyed home reinforces the lesson. The world doesn't seem to care about us. That's what they think. That's what they feel. They inherit grief and anger and fear, and sometimes it turns into support for groups promising to fight back. By the time we get to October 7th, 2023, you have a generation raised on the stories of the Nakba, living under a blockade for over a decade, actually. Watching moderate leadership fail, feeling abandonment by the international community, And seeing Hamas as the only voice that answers their pain. It doesn't justify violence, I guess. Nothing justifies attacks on civilians, right? But it does explain the environment that made such desperation possible. And until those conditions change, the cycle will continue. Oppression breeds despair, and despair breeds extremism. And the innocent, they suffer. If the world wants to stop extremism, we have to stop creating it. Not just by fighting Hamas, but by ending the occupation.
If you're even remotely familiar with Israel and Palestine, then you've probably seen this image. It was the handshake of the century. A handshake that symbolized the end, or at least the beginning of the end, of a decades-long conflict.
We bid them shalom, salam, peace.
But behind the photo op, a much more sinister picture was playing out on the ground.
I think Edward Said said it best when he described the Oslo Accords as a Palestinian Versailles. In other words, complete capitulation.
Created to solve the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Oslo Accords were meant to kick off a 5-year process that would end with peace in the region and an independent Palestinian state. But now, 30 years later, the reality on the ground bears little resemblance to what was promised.
I belong to a generation that has lived its entire life under this Oslo framework, which had it's a facade of a framework that has brought us nothing but increased Israeli oppression and violence.
احنا كل يوم عندنا اقتحامات، كل يوم عندنا طائرات في الأجواء، كل يوم عندنا قتل، كل يوم عندنا جرح، كل يوم عندنا إطلاق نار، كل يوم عندنا اغتيالات، فبالتالي وين الدولة؟ طب وين النتائج الإيجابية لاتفاقية أوسلو؟
Many critics of the Accord say that the Oslo process was actually set up to fail. Do you agree with that characterization?
No. The agreements were set up in order to sell out the Palestinians.
So on October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a massive attack from Gaza into the southern region of Israel. Now, in January of the following year, they released a report, and it said that it was a necessary step against the Israeli occupation. It emphasized that it was only aimed at military targets, and they wanted to capture Israeli soldiers, so the IDF, or the IOF as we've been calling them. But they ended up hurting civilians, I guess. So it says that Hamas in the statement said that avoiding harm to civilians is a religious and moral commitment, but there were some faults because of the deterioration of the area at the border. And it said they didn't mean to. That's what they say. But they do go on to say that it was a calculated military operation aimed at resisting the Israeli occupation and securing the release of many Palestinian prisoners. While the group does acknowledge some operational faults, it maintains that the assault was a justified and necessary action in the broader context of the Israeli-Palestinian context. So I have some questions about October 7th. If Gaza is one of the most controlled, surveilled, and monitored populations on the planet, and Israel has total oversight in airspace, at the borders, water access, electricity, telecommunications, even imported materials, every crossing is controlled, every shipment is documented, it's an open air prison with cameras, with drones, with checkpoints, and intelligence operatives constantly watching them. Okay? And yet this attack happened. That raises a lot of questions for me. Okay, so how could such a large scale operation be planned and executed under such scrutiny without some level of knowledge? And I see a lot of parallels between this and 9/11, because since 9/11, people can say whatever they want about what the truth is. I don't think we even know the scale of the truth as of yet, but I think the government knew. The government knew and didn't prevent it, because I think Dick Cheney watched those planes go into that building and said, now we can go to war with Iraq. I think they avoided stopping it. And I think Benjamin Netanyahu did the same thing. I know for a fact that they're the most monitored population in the world. So how in 2025, with the incredible intelligence that they have, how they had to have known. They had to have known. And I'm not going to debate this. This is purely just my opinion, because I watched 9/11 and the fallout thereafter and all the information that has come out, that is still coming out. And I just see such parallels that it allowed them the next couple years to ethnically cleanse a land of its people, because Hamas attacked them that day. And I will die on that hill. So after October 7th, the response from Israel has been catastrophic for Gaza. This isn't a military operation targeting militants. This is a full-scale siege. A bombardment of a population trapped behind walls under constant fire with nowhere to fucking run. This isn't about Hamas. You can tell that plainly when hospitals are being destroyed or cut off from fuel or electricity. Ambulances can't even move in the street, and water and food and medicine are blocked from entering the region. And like I said, electricity, it barely even exists. Children are living in darkness and in fear and in the rubble of homes that their families have never been given the chance to rebuild. Over 30,000 Palestinians have been killed in the weeks following October 7. The vast majority, civilians, women, children, and the elderly. Tens of thousands more injured. Hundreds of thousands displaced, forced to flee in the middle of a siege. It is the clearest definition of collective punishment, and it is genocide in every sense of the word. This isn't about Hamas. The people of Gaza did not vote for a war on themselves. They didn't plan October 7th. They didn't choose to be trapped, shelled, starved. They are innocent civilians paying for decades of occupation, decades of siege, decades of being forgotten by the world. You cannot separate the children from the policies. You cannot separate families from the checkpoints. When bombs fall on schools or hospitals or refugee camps, that's genocide in action, and the world is just watching. Think about the children for a second, okay? Kids who have never... Kids who were born under a blockade, who have never known a day without checkpoints or sirens. Now they're being killed and starved and fucking terrorized. How many more must die before the world acts? How much more destruction must happen before the international community stops talking and starts protecting civilians? The genocide since October 7 is not a sudden anomaly. It's just the latest chapter in a story that began with the Nakba, expanded under siege, deepened under occupation, and exploded into the horrors that we see today. The children of Gaza, they make up over half the population, and they inherit trauma not only from history, but from every bomb, every demolished home, every day of starvation. If humanity does not intervene, the cycle continues. Despair breeds extremism. Extremism triggers violence, and the innocent pay the price. In the heart of Gaza, amidst the rubble and ruins, lie stories of innocence lost. Children, once full of life and laughter, now mere memories etched in the hearts of grieving families. Zainab Habu Halib, a 5-month-old girl from Han Yunis, weighed less than when she was born when she passed away from malnutrition-related causes. Her tiny body, frail and emaciated, was a stark testament to the horrors of starvation. Her mother, Ezra, stood by her side, helpless as her daughter took her final breath. Then there's Yana, a 9-year-old girl whose skeletal frame and hollow eyes became emblematic of the famine sweeping through Gaza. Despite the valiant efforts of medical staff, she succumbed to the ravages of hunger. Her death was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, devastating pattern. And let's not forget Yazan al-Kaffarne, a 10-year-old boy whose image, gaunt and lifeless, became a symbol of the starvation crisis. His death was a poignant reminder of the human cost of conflict and blockade. These are not just names. These are faces and lives and dreams unfulfilled. Each death is a tragedy, a cry for help that echoes through the corridors of hospitals and the hearts of families. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Israel leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, on charges of war crimes related to the use of starvation as a war weapon. These actions are not just violations of international law, they are crimes against humanity. As the world watches the people of Gaza continue to suffer, it is our collective responsibility to demand accountability and ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. You to try to picture Gaza, an entire city of 2 million people, half of which are children, are trapped behind walls, barbed wire, under constant siege, checkpoints everywhere. Electricity just a few hours a day, if they're lucky, and hospitals are running out of everything. There's barely water coming in. And when it does come in, it's not safe to drink. This isn't a theory, it's happening right now. Human Rights Watch says Israel is using starvation as a weapon. Yes, starvation as a weapon against civilians. It's a fucking war crime. It is a crime against humanity. Hospitals in Gaza, like Kamal Adwan, have seen dozens of children die from malnutrition, dehydration, complications that could have completely been prevented if the world forced Israel to allow a humanitarian corridor to be opened. Doctors and aid workers are speaking out. Families are telling stories because children are just wasting away. You see the mothers and fathers and grandparents scrambling for scraps, trying to keep babies alive, trying to keep hope alive, and it's not enough. UN agencies like UNICEF and WHO and OCHA, they've all said Gaza is teetering on famine. I actually think they just declared famine. So, yes, I just checked because I knew that it was announced in August that they are in famine. It's not even famine, it's forced starvation. It is it is not even fucking famine. This is man fucking made. Sorry, I really tried to last this whole episode without losing my shit, but hundreds of thousands are displaced. Children are dying. People are drinking unsafe water. There isn't enough food to go around, and yet the blockade tightens every day and every hour. And here's the thing, the law is crystal fucking clear. Starving civilians is a war crime. The ICC knows it. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant for using starvation as a method of war. They're being charged. The world knows it. And still, bombs fall and children die. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN, they've documented it. Field reports, interviews, photos, names. You can't ignore this. But you do. It's happening in real time. So, when people ask why there's rage in Gaza, why extremism grows, this is why. Not because people are born inherently violent, not because ideology is innate, because despair becomes survival, because generations grow up hearing stories of the Nakba from grandparents and great-grandparents living under siege, watching children die, and knowing no one's going to help. It's genocide in slow motion. Starvation as a weapon, blockade as a weapon, bombs raining down as punishment against civilians. And the world watching, debating, counting the numbers. But the people, they're dying. Every day. Men, women, children, innocent people caught in a system that sees them as expendable. You want to understand what extremism is? Look at what desperation does. Look at what a generation raised on siege, starvation, and violence becomes. And then tell me, how do we sit back and not act? But we condemn them? I say this all the time. Imagine having a boot on your neck for generations. This is not distant. It's not abstract. It's happening right now. And it's our responsibility to tell the truth. Half the population of Gaza are children. Half. Every second face beneath the rubble is a child who never learned what peace even meant. And yet they call it war. But war means two sides. War means armies. There's no army here. Only civilians, only families with no fucking escape. Only dads digging graves for their daughters. Only women clutching birth certificates because that's all they have left to prove that their babies even existed. And the journalists, you know, there's been over 200 killed for daring to record the truth. Proof that honesty itself is targeted. Then July came and the world gasped. The International Criminal Court, the highest body of law, issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and his buddy, Yoav Gallant, for crimes against humanity, for starvation as a weapon, for murder, for persecution, for using power like a blade on the neck of a starving fucking people. We thought maybe, just maybe, that justice had cracked the wall. So I ask again, where are the arrests? The warrants are signed, the judges have spoken, the charges are written in the blood of the innocent. But Netanyahu still walks free, smiles for cameras with influencers, flies above the world that dares not to touch him. Because Israel says it isn't bound, because the ICC has no army, because power protects itself, because justice only bites when the guilty are small enough to chew. They say it's complicated. Nope. Starving civilians? Not complicated. Bombing hospitals? Not complicated. Shooting aid convoys? Not complicated. Intercepting ships carrying formula and crutches? Not complicated. Fucking cruel. It's cruelty, it's policy, and it's genocide. And yet the same world that built Israel to prevent genocide, now they watch that state create the same crime, the law. Where's the courage to stop treating genocide like a diplomatic inconvenience? If this were anyone else, any other country, any other flag, the sanctions would choke them. But because this one wears the right uniform, the world pretends not to see. And don't start. This is not about Judaism. It's not about faith whatsoever. It's about a government that hides behind it. A government built on occupation and immunity. It's about a man who commands an army that kills children in their beds and calls it defense. It's about an empire that bombs hospitals and calls it precision, that cuts off water and calls it security, that starves a people and calls it strategy. And the world, the same world that once swore to protect the weak, hides behind words like complex, complicated, because the truth is far too inconvenient. But the truth doesn't die. Truth rots in incubators. Truth cries in rubble. Truth is the sound of a mother clawing concrete to find her son. Truth is the silence of the international court that said never again and still hasn't said enough. So I ask again, louder this time, where are the arrests? If justice means anything, then it must mean this: that no child's death is acceptable, that no government stands above consequence, that no man who orders bombs gets to walk free while mothers bury their babies under a sky he commands. Because until that happens, the ICC's ink is just fucking decoration. The warrants are theater, and justice is a ghost that only haunts the powerless. But make no mistake, ghosts rise, and history keeps receipts. And somebody, when the cameras turn away and the politicians are gone, the names of those children will be the only truth that remains. And the question will echo through every court, every government, and every generation. Where were you when they bombed the babies? Where were you when Gaza burned? And where were the arrests? The world is turning now, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. For decades, we watched screens flickering with dust and blood and people erased pixel by pixel. History rewritten in live broadcast. And they called it self-defense. For decades, we watched as children's bodies became statistics and olive trees became graves, and the world's conscience became negotiable. But the people are awaking. Not governments, not empires, not those who count profits in barrels and contracts, but people. The mothers watching from London, the students marching in Toronto and Montreal, the elders chanting in Johannesburg, and the children in New York drawing keys and flags on cardboard, signs that say Free Palestine. The tide, it's turned. The silence is cracking, and the word genocide will not be sanitized by press releases or PR-trained politicians. We see it, the ethnic cleansing of a land that has already buried generations too many, the bombs dropped with our taxes, the lies printed with our names. Not anymore, though. Not in our name, not on our dime. While they starve Gaza and call it strategy. Not while they bomb hospitals and call it security. Not while they murder journalists and call it misinformation. Because the truth, the real truth, it doesn't need propaganda. It bleeds through every border. It bleeds through every mother's scream, through every child clutching a ration of water in a desert of indifference. This is a reckoning, you know. The awakening, the moment when the world finally says, we will not be complicit. Because humanity is not dead. It's rising from the rubble, from the grief, from the silence that once smothered our tongues. And this time we will not look away. We will not wait for leaders to find courage. We will not apologize for our outrage. We will stand, we will speak, and we will march. We won't stop. Not until every bomb is grounded, until every child is home and every land stolen is free again. Because the people, the real people, we've seen enough. And we are done funding genocides. We're done justifying murder. We're done being silent. The world is turning. And this time, it's finally turning towards justice.